Battle of Bosworth Field. Henry Tudor toppled. Richard III ending the Wars of the Roses. What would you do if your crown was on the line and betrayal lurked at every corner? Would you charge headfirst into a battlefield, knowing it could be your last? Well, that's exactly what happened on a fateful August morning in 1485 at Bosworth Field. Picture it. Two rivals, Richard III, England's most controversial king, and Henry Tudor, an exiled underdog, clashing in a battle that would decide the fate of England's throne. But how did we get here? Why did a king gamble his life on a reckless charge? What made Henry, the least likely heir, rise from the shadows and unite the warring factions of Lancaster and York? Was it a brilliant strategy, a stroke of luck, or the treachery of a noble who switched sides at the perfect moment? And what about those two princes locked away in the tower? Did they meet their end at Richard's hands, sealing his doom? Get ready for a wild ride through the chaos, mystery, and shocking twists of the Wars of the Roses as we unravel the secrets behind the most infamous betrayal in English history. Will Richard's crown stay on his head, or will Henry, the exiled avenger, seize it from the thorny bushes of fate? Stick with us, and by the end, you'll know how a battle shaped an entire dynasty. The summer of 1485 was like no other in England, a tempest brewing over the throne, a kingdom in chaos, and a showdown looming that would determine the fate of a dynasty. England had spent decades embroiled in a family feud more intense than a holiday dinner gone wrong. This was the Wars of the Roses, a back-and-forth bloodbath between two royal houses, the Lancasters, led by a gaggle of menacing red roses, and the Yorks, sporting their more austere white. But before we get to the explosive finale at Bosworth, let's rewind. The story starts with a dramatic cast of characters, where betrayal, ambition, and a healthy dose of murder paved the way to the battlefield. The Wars of the Roses began because medieval England had a problem. It was full of very ambitious cousins. The throne of England was passed around like an overly warm potato, with everyone staking a claim. The key dispute? Who had a better right to the crown, the Lancastrians or the Yorkists? And as with all good family feuds, it started with the Plantagenets. You see, back in the days of Edward III, his sons had spread out across the kingdom, founding various branches of the royal family tree. The Lancasters came from Edward's third son, John of Gaunt. We'll get to his scandalous love life later. And the Yorks from his fourth son, Edmund of Langley. Flash forward to the mid-1400s. The Lancastrians, led by the tragically incompetent Henry VI, held the throne, but his inability to rule and to stay awake during half his reign due to periodic bouts of madness made him an easy target. Enter Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York, and his claim to power, which kicked off the Wars of the Roses. Though Richard's dreams of kingship ended with his head on a spike in 1460, his sons carried on the fight. And thus came Edward IV, a Yorkist with the charisma of a warrior king and the battlefield skills to match. He defeated the Lancastrians at Towton in 1461 and became king. But like a medieval soap opera, the drama was just beginning. Now Richard III's story is like something out of a Shakespearean play. Oh wait, it actually is. Born on October 2, 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle, not exactly the Buckingham Palace of its day, Richard was the youngest of four surviving sons of Cecily Neville, the Rose of Raby, and Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, the man who started this whole bloody mess. Cecily was no ordinary woman. She was the great-granddaughter of Edward III, and more importantly, the mother of two Yorkist kings, Edward IV, and of course, Richard III. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Richard wasn't supposed to become king. His eldest brother, Edward IV, held the crown firmly, with Richard loyally serving by his side, fighting in battles and becoming a trusted confidant. But fate, or rather, a nasty bout of pneumonia, had other plans for Edward. When Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, the throne passed to his 12-year-old son, Edward V. Here's where things get juicy. Richard, named Lord Protector for the boy king, swooped in with all the tact of a fox guarding a henhouse. While escorting his nephew to London for his coronation, Richard arrested Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, Edward V's uncle on his mother's side, and locked him up. Soon after, Richard took control of young Edward, And from there, the story gets darker than a foggy London night. Richard declared the young king's parents' marriage illegitimate, conveniently making the boy ineligible for the throne. And just like that, on June 26, 1483, Richard was declared king, and the two princes, Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, were locked away in the Tower of London, never to be seen again. Some say Richard III had them murdered, while others theorize they simply vanished into the night. Either way, Richard's reign began with a blood-soaked mystery. Richard III's rule was short but brutal. His rise to power had been paved with bodies, literally. The ruthless elimination of anyone who opposed him, like his betrayal and execution of William Hastings, former Lord Chamberlain, shocked even the most hardened nobles. But Richard's ambition didn't stop there. He had his eye on a union with Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, and perhaps his best chance at cementing his grip on power. But first, he had to deal with his wife, Anne Neville, daughter of the infamous Warwick the Kingmaker and widow of Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian heir. Richard had personally helped slay at Tewkesbury. When Anne died in 1485, whispers of poison spread like wildfire. Richard's pursuit of Elizabeth was desperate and a bit creepy, but it was also political dynamite. Richard III was not what you'd call well-liked. As King of England, he had a knack for making enemies, many of whom were still quite alive. After all, when you usurp the throne from your young nephews and lose them in the Tower of London, it does raise some eyebrows. Richard's reign had been a shaky one since 1483, especially with the persistent whispers that he had a hand in the disappearance, or worse, of the princes in the Tower. But that's not all. Let's rewind and take a look at the labyrinth of treachery that had gotten us to this point. You see, Richard had seized the crown after the sudden death of his brother, King Edward IV. With his nephews declared illegitimate, Richard made himself king, a move that wasn't exactly welcomed by the Yorkist supporters. To make matters worse, he executed his closest ally, the Duke of Buckingham, in 1483 after a rebellion. Spoiler, it didn't help. Richard's grasp on power was slipping, and across the Channel in France, Henry Tudor, the last real hope for the Lancastrians, was scheming, plotting, and probably practicing his victory speech. But Henry Tudor wasn't exactly a straight-shot claimant to the throne. His claim was through his mother, the indomitable Lady Margaret Beaufort. Her bloodline traced back to John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, third son of Edward III, but here's the catch. She was descended from his illegitimate line, the Beauforts, who had been born out of Gaunt's relationship with Catherine Swynford. They were later legitimized, but with a neat little clause that excluded them from any actual claim to the throne. Illegitimate? Check. Half-forgotten bloodline? Check. But Henry had something more valuable than a clean claim: ambition, an army, and the fiery determination of his mother, Lady Margaret. This Beaufort was no wilting flower. She was a political powerhouse, orchestrating alliances like a grand chess master. History isn't just about dates and facts. It's about stories. Stories of triumph, betrayal, love, and war that have shaped the world we live in today. By subscribing to our channel, you're not just following along. You're becoming part of these epic tales. Imagine being the first to dive deep into the dramatic rise of kings, the fall of empires, and the battles that turn the tides of history. You'll experience gripping narratives, unravel hidden plots, and see history come alive with every video we release. Each battle we cover holds lessons that echo in today's world, and by subscribing, you won't miss a single moment of these jaw-dropping, game-changing events. So hit that subscribe button, because together, we'll not just witness history, we'll live it. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Enter Elizabeth Woodville, former Queen of England, widow of Edward IV, and mother of those missing princes. After Richard took the crown, Elizabeth didn't exactly feel safe. She had taken sanctuary along with her daughters and began weaving her own web of alliances. With her sons missing and likely dead, Elizabeth knew that her daughter, Elizabeth of York, was the key to future power. In a political plot twist fit for Shakespeare, Elizabeth Woodville aligned herself with Lady Margaret Beaufort. Now imagine the scene. Two formidable women, both mothers to future monarchs, sipping tea and plotting to take down Richard III. They agreed that Henry Tudor should marry Elizabeth of York, uniting the Red Rose of Lancaster with the White Rose of York and effectively ending the bloody feud. But there was one small problem. Richard had other ideas. Not only did he strip Elizabeth Woodville of her lands after the failed Buckingham Rebellion, but in a final act of desperation, Richard planned to marry Elizabeth of York himself. That's right, he wanted to wed his niece. If you think that sounds twisted, well, it was. Not to mention, a marriage between Richard and Elizabeth could have unraveled Henry Tudor's entire scheme. Back in 1483, when Henry Tudor had first tried to invade, things didn't exactly go to plan. The Duke of Buckingham, who had once been Richard's closest ally, suddenly switched sides and decided to back Henry. But, as if the universe itself were invested in keeping things dramatic, a great storm engulfed the English Channel, delaying Henry's landing. Stranded and powerless, Henry was forced to wait while Buckingham's rebellion went down in flames. Buckingham was captured and executed, leaving Richard to breathe a temporary sigh of relief. However, this misstep did not deter Henry. After narrowly avoiding capture himself, thanks to Richard's sneaky deal with Brittany to hand him over, Henry fled to France. There, in Rennes Cathedral on Christmas Day 1483, he publicly declared his intention to marry Elizabeth of York and cement his claim to the throne. The French, sensing an opportunity to destabilize England, provided Henry with soldiers, ships, and the confidence to try again. On August 1st, 1485, Henry set sail from Harfleur with an army of about 5,000 men. By August 7th, he had landed at Milford Haven on the Welsh coast, marching through Wales and gathering more supporters along the way. By the time he reached Bosworth, his numbers had swelled to around 8,000. It was now or never. Meanwhile, Richard, having learned of Henry's landing, quickly gathered his forces. By the time both armies converged on Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, Richard had taken up a defensive position on a hill, with his army numbering around 10,000. And there, looming ominously, was Lord Stanley, Henry's stepfather, who had taken up a separate position on the battlefield, neither fully committing to Richard nor Henry. Talk about playing both sides. The morning of August 22nd had dawned, and the two forces squared off. Richard, perched on his hill, eyed the forces below. Henry, knowing he was outnumbered, waited cautiously at the rear, while his commander, John de Vere, 13th Earl of Oxford, led the Lancastrian troops. It was a slow start, a few artillery exchanges here and there, but when the real fighting began, it was brutal. The Lancastrians, through sheer grit, began to gain the upper hand. Richard, sensing the tide turning, ordered Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, to charge, but Percy, for reasons known only to himself, refused to budge. Perhaps he feared the boggy ground, or maybe he was just tired of taking orders from a man who had mysteriously lost his nephews. With no other option left, Richard made a bold decision. He was going to charge Henry Tudor directly and end this. Spurring his horse, Richard and his men thundered down the hill, crashing into Henry's bodyguard. In the chaos, Richard cut down Henry's standard-bearer and came within feet of Tudor himself. But just as it looked like Richard might snatch victory, Lord Stanley finally made his move. His brother William Stanley attacked Richard's flank, and the king's men began to fall all around him. Richard, now unhorsed, found himself surrounded. He fought fiercely, but his men were slain one by one until Richard was left virtually alone. Ever the defiant monarch, he supposedly shouted, "God forbid that I retreat one step. I will either win the battle as a king or die as one." And die he did. A fatal blow struck him down, and Richard III, the last king of England to die on the battlefield, fell in the dust. His crown, found conveniently in a hawthorn bush, was placed on Henry Tudor's head. Lord Stanley declared him king, and just like that, the Wars of the Roses were over. In 1486, true to his word, Henry married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses. The famous Tudor rose, a combination of the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, became the symbol of this newfound peace. Henry's reign marked the beginning of a new dynasty that would go on to produce some of England's most iconic monarchs, including his larger-than-life son, Henry VIII, and the legendary Elizabeth I. But that's a story for another day. For now, let's leave the Battle of Bosworth as it was, a tale of ambition, betrayal, and a crown that ended up in the hands of a man who wasn't even supposed to have it. And as Richard III learned that day, never underestimate the power of a hawthorn bush. Coming up next, Battle of Flodden, King James IV's final stand, the battle that ended a dynasty. How did a king's loyalty to his ally lead to disaster? And what happens when ambition turns into tragedy on the battlefield? The Battle of Flodden, 1513 AD, where Scotland's King James IV faced England's forces, and history took a deadly turn. As James led the largest Scottish army ever assembled into England, why did he risk everything for glory? What fateful decisions led to his downfall and the loss of thousands of lives? In one brutal day, a crown was lost and a kingdom was forever changed. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss this gripping tale of loyalty, pride, and bloodshed.